Good evening, everybody. Uh, really, thank you very much for logging in to listen. Um, no comments about my hair. It's a bit of a bouffon. This is lockdown hair. What we want to try and go through today really is about um, coaching para athletes and the fact that it really isn't any different. Hopefully, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you that everything that you already do is applicable to coaching an athlete that's got an impairment. And you'll hear me using the word impairment as we go along. There's my mug shot on the first slide. There's some athletes there that you can see that a coach, Libby, Amy Hunt, who isn't an impaired athlete. I've got the majority of my group haven't got an impairment, but my athletes with an impairment work alongside my athletes that don't have an impairment, and you'll see that in some of the videos and slides as we go along. We had a long conversation about what we should call this, and a phrase that kept coming up because it was really hard to signpost it was it's just coaching, and it's what you do now all the time. You turn up on your club nights or your club days and you coach the people that's in front of you. And what I want to try and demonstrate is that actually what you do with your athletes is going to be no different to what you would do with the majority of para athletes. So I think one of the things as coaches that we always try and think about is what's the prime objective when you're coaching an athlete? What do you look at? You're looking at balance, you try and understand the athlete, you're looking at what their capability is. Do they have any biomechanical issues that you might need to do to sort out for either strength or balance? Balance is a big thing for me because if an athlete isn't balanced, well then I always go back to basics and get them balanced and then move forward. So you try and understand your athletes, try and understand every individual athlete because they are individuals. You try and understand if they've got poor learned movement, and that could be because of a different sport that they've done and they've come in to athletics. So one of the things I liken it to is if you have someone that played hockey, they're in that sitting position with a stick, and then they come down and they want to be sprinters. There's a certain amount of work you have to do to kind of change that shape so that they can become an effective sprinter. And then you try and understand other poor movement that you may have. And again, that could be through a lack of strength or a lack of ability. But you do that as a coach, you just look at all those things and you try and improve it, because that's a job. Our job is to develop athletes. We may look at how we adapt a drill for someone that has poor movement. So if you think about getting an athlete to do hurdle drills, it may be that you lower the hurdle initially so that he can step over that hurdle. Well, that's a drill adaptation, and that's nothing different that you would do to one of your athletes that doesn't have an impairment. And then, of course, what would you consider? You look at some of the issues that an athlete may turn up at, and you do a lot of consideration around what do I do first? Do I make them stronger? Do I make them balanced? Do I fix the shape? But actually, as a coach, there's a lot of consideration around what you would do with any athlete that turns up. And if you have a look at the next slide, actually, you do exactly the same with an athlete with an impairment. So understanding an athlete when they come to you at the track, if you had an athlete with an impairment, you would try and understand that classification. Who else is in that classification? What does that classification mean to them? So understanding poor learned movement and understanding poor movement, two very key things when you're coaching athletes with an impairment. There's a lot of athletes that will turn up that have got an impairment, and the poor learned movement they have is exactly that. The body has taught them to move in a specific way, so it's easier for them to move. And then you have the poor movement that's caused by their impairment. So there's a little bit of work around what poor movement is caused by the impairment and what is just poor learnt movement, because over years they've just adapted to a specific way of moving. And we do that with any athlete that turns up. You know, we look and we see how we can improve them. So adapting drills, hopefully what you're going to see with some of the videos later on is some of those adaptations, and then an understanding of actually it's really not that different to what you would do with an athlete without an impairment. And then your consideration, you know, what would you consider if an athlete turned up with an impairment? So if you've got any questions just about that, because there's a lot in there. So if you've got any questions about that, I suppose now is a good time if you want to ask a question. So if there's any questions. Okay, there's a question here from Daniel McCurlick. I hope I've pronounced that right. And it says, I have learning difficulties and classified as a T20 and have recently done my coaching assistance course. What is the best way to get into disability athletics coaching? Go down to your local club. Go down to your local club, get involved. What we're trying to do with this webinar and other information that hopefully comes out later on is to try and introduce coaches to the fact that you don't have to be a disability athletics coach. You're an athletics coach. If you're an athletics coach, you will have skills in your toolkit that allows you to coach anybody that comes down to your track. So I very rarely talk about people being disability athletics coaches. I talk about them being athletics coaches, because that's exactly what we all are. We all coach athletics, and we coach the individual that's in front of us. So for you, Daniel, go down to your local club, get involved, and if athletes turn up with an impairment and you can help them, that's fantastic. So really nice question. Thanks for that, Daniel. Hope that helps. A question from Mike Leonard. So just so you know, Mike Leonard has been my mentor for years, and he's been absolutely amazing with me, helping me along. So thanks for joining in, Mike. And hopefully I can answer your question. Can you describe a little bit about the classification process, Joe? How difficult is it to get classified? Really good question, Mike. The classification process, I've got another presentation, and actually I've got a picture of a minefield, because sometimes it can be a minefield. But very simply, in the UK, in Great Britain, what happens is there are classification clinics that run throughout the country, throughout the year, about four times in different locations. There's some in London, some in Manchester. There's also some in Northern Ireland, and I believe Scotland and Wales do some as well. So the very first thing that you have to do is find out of either Coral Norris, Job King, or Shelley Holroyd. They will be able to give you information on when those clinics are on. Initially, what happens is you get a national classification, and once that national classification is done, if you then go and compete internationally, you have to have an international classification, which potentially verifies your national classification. Without an international classification, you cannot compete internationally. The process itself, the lady that runs it, Kirsty Allen, she will require a batch of documentation about your impairment. They take that, that's checked, and if you're within the classification for whatever impairment is you've got, you then get invited to a classification panel, which then takes place in some of those locations that I said, London, Loughborough, or Manchester. And you get into a classification clinic and you're classified. Generally in that classification clinic, there is a physio, a technical classifier, a doctor. So there will be a number of people in there checking medical records. It's very heavily medically biased, and rightly so, because we need to make sure that everybody is in a classification that's fair and allows them the opportunity to compete at the highest level in their own classification. Andy Poppleton, apologies if this crops up later, but how would you recommend first querying whether an athlete has an impairment? Personally, I'm not aware of what all impairments that fall into recognised categories are. Really good question, Andy. Some of it is experience, and that's what we're trying to do with this particular webinar, and hopefully some other information that you will all get is about how do you locate an athlete that comes to your group that may have an impairment. If it's a T20 impairment, which is an intellectual impairment, they would be potentially statemented at the school to show that they got learning difficulty. It could be someone that turns up that has an issue with their arm or with their leg, or was born with cerebral palsy, or has got MS, or has had a stroke. So they're in the neurological classes. Some of them are very obvious. Someone may turn up with an amputated arm or a leg that's been amputated. So they're very easy to recognise. But or if they're in a wheelchair, it's very easy to recognise. It's not very easy to classify, but very easy to recognise. At the end of this presentation, I have tried to put some explanation around what impairments are in the different classes. So hopefully that helps. But if not, also my information is there. So contact me and I can try and help out. Bash, how you doing? My biggest concern with disability is pushing them too soon, as they are often overzealous. How do you deal with zealous athletes? Well, that's not just athletes with an impairment, is it? I think we all have athletes that turn up that want to be amazing next year. And our job as coaches is to develop athletes at their maturation rate, develop them in stages so that we don't put them at risk and we don't injure them. And so, like I said earlier on, for me, the one thing I always look at is a back to basics thing. Have you got balance? And if someone hasn't got balance, well then, as coaches, we all have lots of stuff in our toolkit that we can help with that. And that's what I always look at first. So yeah, it's great having overzealous athletes, by the way. But yeah, as a coach, if they're really, really keen, use that keenness, but also develop them at the rate that they can develop. Some athletes have I think they think that disability athletics or para athletics is an easy route into elite sport. For the years that I've been involved in it, it gets tougher year after year after year. Last year in Dubai, I witnessed someone that's a T12, so that's a visual impairment. He ran, I think it was 10:38 that he ran. Seriously good athlete. And there's no reason that athlete won't get close to it, a 10 flat over 100 meters. There's amazing athletes that compete in para athletics. So I think there's a realization that now this is getting along the same as an Olympic pathway. It's going to take years of training to get to an elite level. But yeah, it's great if they're really enthusiastic to do stuff. Fiona Darling Glinsky, great name. And my interest is developing children with autism and learning differences or learning difficulties. Can you nod to this interest as you go through your presentation at all? Yeah, so actually one of the athletes that's in the video, you will see, and I'll introduce him later on, his name is Sean Burrows. So Sean has a learning difficulty, and I'll talk about Sean a bit. So yeah, happy to do that. Graham Pilkington. Good evening, Graham. How you doing? What ways do you look at adaptive activities to challenge poor movement with young athletes? Would you start just looking at a day-to-day movement and stability? I know that Graham is of the same mind as me, and I know that Graham would probably be happy that I'd said it's just coaching, because it is. And if you look at any athlete that comes along, you try and challenge the movement and you challenge their stability and the balance. One of the things, and he's absolutely right, so day to day, and I've already alluded to it, there's a lot of poor learned movement. And what you really have to try and install with any athlete that's got poor learned movement is that they do have to take homework away, and they do have to change some of their day-to-day movement. Athletes in the neurological disorder, especially cerebral palsy, they're affected by heat and cold, so they have to look at adjusting at different times of the year as well. But yet day-to-day movement, it's really important that they practice it, because the neural pathway for someone that's got cerebral palsy is slowed down. So it's very easy for that neural pathway to kind of lose that muscle memory. So it is important that they have some day-to-day stuff to help with movement and stability. Thanks, Graham. Really nice question. So, understanding an athlete. So that's got classification in there. It could say understanding their previous sport because they played hockey. It could say understanding their previous sport because they played basketball or netball or rugby or football. And by understanding what the athlete did before may give you an insight into some of the movement that you see and why they move like that. And they've learned to move like that because that's the way you have to move to be an effective footballer. So understanding poor movement due to the impairment, it's exactly the same. If you can understand the impairment, and the information about each impairment is at the end of this presentation, a slight understanding around the impairment will give you an idea of some of the restrictions. So like I said, someone with cerebral palsy, only 60% of their muscle bulk is really effective. So there's 40% that really doesn't know what they need to do. So, how do I adapt that? Sometimes that's adapted and helped with heat and neurological activity. So if anybody wants more information on that, I'm happy to go into that. How would you adapt the drill and your consideration? And talking about considerations, one of the reasons I put on this, because hopefully this is something that we all use, this force velocity curve, and we all, I'm sure, go through all of that with our athletes. Well, training all these different aspects of the force velocity curve is exactly the same. Think about the model that you're trying to achieve, and actually the model that you're trying to achieve for an athlete with an impairment is kind of exactly the same. We're talking about kind of sprints here. It's exactly the same. You want them to be effective out of the blocks. You want to have a look that, are they getting their foot into a good position behind the knee to create force off the start? Does the shape when they're at maximal speed, the work that they do in the gym, you're still trying to create a model that will build strength and build power. We all know vertical force is horizontal speed. That doesn't change if an athlete's got an impairment or not. You're still trying to achieve that. So impairment or no impairment, the athletes, you try to develop all those physical qualities. So, and then sometimes with that, what you need to do is be a little bit, just think outside the box a bit. Think, well, what can I get this athlete to do? And a great place to start with that is ask the athlete with the impairment. They will have adapted more things in their life than you're ever going to dream of. So quite often they come up with the answer and you don't need to do it. You just have to explain to them what you need, and they will give you some ideas around how they adapt things themselves. So the next slide, talking about, and this is not really an adaptation, I just want to kind of show you a couple of videos. So you can see there on that triangle, you still have to get work capacity, you still have to get force production, you still have to get really good functional movement, and you still have to have sport specific training. So again, some videos, the people that are on these videos here, on the pictures here, Steph Reid, long jumper and sprinter, below knee amputee, won a gold medal in London 2017 at the World Championships. Dan Greaves down here, he's a 64 meter discus throw. Dan has got talipes, which means that he's got one of his legs that's very affected, so there's no muscle through from the Achilles up through the calf. Sammy Kinghorn, wheelchair athlete, incredible wheelchair athlete, and one of the people that is fantastic to listen to when she talked about how she adapted to her sport. So Dan was born with talipes. Steph lost her leg in an accident in a boat. Sammy ended up in a wheelchair from an accident as well. So with the video that I'm going to show you, let's have a look at this one. So I'm just going to show you the video, and then I'll talk a little bit about what's on there. Simple reactive jumps. So that was Tom Youngs that jumped. He's got NF1, neurofibrosis 1. This is Sean Burrows. He's got cerebral palsy and a learning, intellectual impairment for learning. And this is Holly Baskin, who was a cheerleader. So just so you know, Tom has got an impairment. John has got an impairment. Holly Baskin comes from a cheerleading background. So Holly is the only one in that group that doesn't have an impairment, but she's only a year into athletics. So again, we're looking at how we build up some strength, some reactive strength. She's very balanced because of kind of the background she comes from. I'm so pleased I did that right, because I was practicing this today to try and make sure that I'd come back to the right slide. So that's really good. So there you have, athletes with impairments, and there's nothing different that you would do there than you would do to, any of your athletes that are in your group. And then we're going to look at this slide. Okay, that's taken a bit of time to load up. So I'll just go back to the presentation because that's taken a bit of time to load up. So what you in this picture here, you've got Libby Clegg. Libby Clegg is a T11, so she's the worst of the visually impaired. So because she's a T11, she runs with a guide and with a blindfold on. Libby recently did Dancing on Ice, if any of you watched Dancing on Ice, and skated, and she's just about blind. Absolutely incredible. But her training program is no different to anybody else. I'm going to try and load that slide again and see if it plays. If it doesn't play, I'll just skip and go on to the next one. It doesn't look like it's going to play, so I'm just going to move on. So training methods. So you heard me say earlier on about athletes with cerebral palsy around understanding heat and activation, tissue tolerance load. So that's one of the things that's key with, especially around CP athletes, is that understanding that the cold, so you're looking for your core muscle temperature to be around that 35, 36 degrees for it, to be warm and ready to go. Well, people with cerebral palsy, because their muscle bulk doesn't really work very well, it's really hard to maintain a lot of the heat, and cold massively affects them. So using some sort of heat to keep the muscles warm is really, really useful. But that just doesn't work with cerebral palsy. You have to have heat and neurological activity. If you think about any Olympic sprinter getting onto the line, they've done the warm up, they've gotten to the chain, into the call room, they've done whatever they do in the call room, they get into the line. It's a couple of sprints, couple of jumps, whatever it is that they need to activate and get themselves ready. Kind of not that simple for someone with cerebral palsy. What you need to do is keep that heat maintenance in the muscle tissue while they're in the call room, and then also keep some neural activity in there. So we found through a lot of testing that is really effective and works really, really well. Strength training, increase high force production during testing. So I do a lot of testing in conjunction with Sam Heathcote, who's the S&C coach for British Athletics for para athletes. Sam has got a massive bank of information that he's been working at that's been incredible, and I know it certainly helped me as a coach for my athletes. And I'm going to, it says here about increased squat and deadlift load, speed training, ability to run at an increased velocity. None of this is different to what you do with any of your athletes that hasn't got an impairment. I'll jump onto this video here and I'll show you Tom. So Tom has got a neurofibrosis 1. It does cause Tom to have some poor movement. It is one of the effects of NF1. So this is Tom. MJ. Really simple. That testing. So just for your information, that's testing that I do with all my athletes, who you can see sitting in the background here. Before we train, so I've got some ready to train program that I run through to make sure an athlete is ready to train. If their counter movement jumps aren't as good as what they normally are, sometimes I will change the plan. If they're better than they normally are, sometimes I will tweak the plan so I get a bit more out of them for that session. I'm going to show you Sean Burrows doing exactly the same exercise.
3, 2, 1, jump.
Sean is a 2-stroke 400-meter runner. Tom is a 1-stroke 200-meter runner. So you can see there is absolutely, and what I'm trying to get people to understand is that there's nothing different in there than you would do with your athletes that you've got that come down to your track. And this is, I suppose this is the bit, and someone asked earlier on, I think it was Mike Leonard asked earlier on, about classification, the classification process. So what's the impairment? What caused it? So that's going to be crucial. I'm going to show you some videos later on of some people that have impairments that they were born with. Some people have got impairments, so they had a catastrophic incident that happened to them that put them in a position where they've got an impairment. So what's the impairment and what caused it? How did they acquire the impairment? Were they born with it? It's kind of the same question. Who else has the same or similar impairment? Who can I compare to? Because that's a great thing with para-athletics, because you can go and have a look with someone that's got a similar impairment and have a look to see what they do. One of the things about the para community is that we're very good at sharing information, because we do want to, I liken it to what sharing best practice, which is kind of what we're doing through these webinars. Share the best practice. It makes us all better coaches. If we're all better coaches, we'll have better athletes. And so comparing or going to ask coaches that have potentially got an athlete with an impairment. I know when I first started coaching, and I suppose it was Sam Ruddock, who had cerebral palsy, who I first started coaching. And I am a kind of person that if I want to know about someone, I'll go and educate myself on it because I want to know about it, because I want to do whatever is best. The people that I asked, Katie Jones, who's the program manager now, Paula Dunn, Keith Antoine, all of these people had just incredible knowledge. Jim Edwards, who's a throws coach. I went and asked coaches that coached para-athletes. It didn't matter whether they were sprinters or not. I just needed to understand and find out. So go and ask people questions so you can compare. And you know what? The likelihood is that people will be happy to give you information. So what's the impairment? Who do I compare to? How does it affect them? You can look at their movement, whether it's poor movement, and I've said this before, poor movement or poor learned movement. Poor movement due to the impairment, poor learned movement because their body is just looking for an easy way around. What does their impairment restrict them from performing in exercise? So again, I'm going to show you some videos that hopefully you'll see some adaptions and you'll kind of go, all right, I get that. I can see why that adaptions work. And when can or can't they train due to their impairment? So if it's someone with an impairment because of, let's say, MS, it might be that there's medication that they have to take that stops them from doing training at certain times because they take medication. It may make them fatigued. So just discuss that with your athlete if they're taking any sort of medication. So before I go on to the adaptions, and these are great videos, by the way, let's have 2 or 3 questions for people that have asked anything in particular. Graham Lamb. I have started coaching a double blade runner, trying some sprinting. Where can I find running drills that are appropriate? Okay, so my question, Graham, would be, this double blade runner, are they a below knee or above knee blade runner? Because that makes it very, very different. It potentially makes the drills and some of the techniques that you would use quite different. If they're a double below knee blade runner, depending on whether they've been born with that or whether they had a catastrophic incident and they've had to have an amputation, also makes a difference. So really good places to look. So I mentioned Keith Antoine and also Richard Whitehead. They put lots of stuff on YouTube that's there for people that are double above knee, people with blades. If you're a double below knee with blades, you've kind of got an exceptional sprinter, and simply because I don't know whether they've got calves, but they certainly won't have Achilles tendons. So there are lots of information there. But the people that are below knee, train them exactly the same as you would train any athlete that comes down. They can still do hurdle drills. You can still have effective sprint starts using blocks. No difference, absolutely no difference at all. But if you give me some more information, I'll certainly be able to help you or point you in the right direction with it. Any questions? Mark Thomas. How do you demonstrate drills or movement patterns to blind athletes? Really, really good. So one of the I remember when I think it was my level 1, and I can't remember the name of the person that took the course, but one of the things that they really spoke about was listening. And I've coached a number of athletes that got visual impairments, So what you have to be very good at is articulating the skill to the athlete. And we're very good at always using demonstration for an athlete to learn from. And you've made a really good point, Mark, around, well, if I've got an athlete that can't see that drill, how do I functionally get them to do that drill? Blindfold yourself and do the drill and think about every movement, because that's how you're going to articulate it to that individual. People that are visually impaired are very perceptive and they learn very, very quickly. So walking next to them and explaining the drill, and walk from the bottom up with the drill. You know, articulate it as well as you can. If you're going to, don't just assume that you know you're putting your left foot back or your right foot forward. Literally talk through every movement. If you want some help with that, really happy to help with that, because that's one of the things that I'm really passionate about and I really enjoy doing. So articulation of the drill is really important. So practice it on yourself. And I did that, and it's scary, but practice it on yourself. So looking at some adaptations of different bits of work in the gym. So let's start here. So what we're going to see here is a hex bar deadlift. So we're going to start off with Sean Burrows again. So Sean has an intellectual impairment. He's also got cerebral palsy. So Sean is one of those athletes that started off in the Special Olympics, then became a T20, which means he's got an intellectual impairment or an intellectual difference. But then cerebral palsy was his overriding impairment. So he then became a T37, which is someone that's hemiplegic, so is affected on one side. When he went for international classification, they moved him to a T38, which is the least impaired. So Sean is kind of midway on the T38 classification, coming towards the bottom. So he is affected very much by fatigue. And there's, from coaching Sean, there are simple things that I see when I know Sean's getting fatigued. But this is Sean doing hex bar deadlift.
Squeeze those shoulders flat back, Sean.
So hopefully what you heard was an instruction from Sam Heathcote saying, squeeze those shoulders flat back, Sean. It's no different instruction that you'd give to an athlete that hasn't got an impairment. So that movement, you're still trying to get that copybook movement of what you would want from someone with an impairment. So let's have a look at the next one. So the next one that we're going to look at is Holly Arnold. Holly Arnold, you can see Holly here. She's a 46/47, so she's got no right arm below the elbow. So this is an adaptation to help Holly do hex bar. So think about what we're trying to do when we get people to do these exercises in the gym. We're trying to work on that kind of strength and that hip function. Because like I said, vertical forces, horizontal speed, around your hips, your core, that's your engine. You want to be able to work that and being able to adapt exercises. So generally someone would have looked at Holly and gone, well, it's really going to be difficult to do gym work, and we can't get her to do deadlift. We can't get her to do, we may be able to get her to do squats, but certainly deadlifts or cleans will be out. There are adaptations you can put in. So the next one I'm going to show you is Luke Sinnott. So this is a person that's had a catastrophic event. He was serving his country in the armed forces, was in a blast and lost both of his legs above the knee. So here we go. I'll just let you watch this. Look what he's trying to execute through his hips. So if I try and stop it, here, you can see the adaptation here is that these are what people with attachment, like they call them stubbies, and that's what they kind of walk on if they're not in their day legs or in their blades. So this is something that was Luke got sorted out so that he could effectively do gym work. Richard Whitehead doesn't use anything. He does all this on his stumps. Luke can't. He can't do that because he's got irregular height on his stumps. So this keeps him level and allows him to do the exercise. So that's just some adaptations there that you can see. Let's go on to the next slide because I've got some more adaptations on there. So this, we're going to look at different variations of clean that you may get someone that you might have to adapt. So I'm going to show you first, actually I'll introduce them first. Here you've got Zach Skinner. Zach Skinner is a visually impaired athlete. He's a T13, and so he's the least of the visually impaired. He is a long jumper stroke sprinter, but more of a long jumper. If any of you that like rugby or that are really interested in rugby, his dad was Mike Skinner, who played for England and the Lions. Used to call him Mike the Munch Skinner because he used to absolutely batter people in tackles. You've got Jonathan Broom Edwards here, who's got talipes, the same as Dan Greaves. And you've got Georgie Hermitage here, who's a T37, and so she's hemiplegic, so she's affected on one side through CP. So Zach, here's Zach. Again, you're looking for really good functional movement. There's nothing there that you're trying to adapt, because if someone's got a visual impairment, the likelihood is they, other than not being able to see very well, actually physically, they should be able to do everything else that anybody else can do. And it's the same approach as I have with Libby Clegg. There's physically nothing wrong with her limbs, so they should be able to really work with very little adaptation. So Jonathan Broom Edwards. So Jonathan, if you can see here, his right leg, he's got good calf, etc. Left leg, he's got talipes. So that really restricts his movement on there. And clean. So you can see the difference in legs here. We're still trying to get him into a good position. That's not a great hand clean, but his goal would be to be able to execute that model much better. So he works with Sam, trying to get that model better. With the progress goal should be that he's able to execute that really, really well. And so the next adaptation is Georgie Hermitage. So think about why you get someone to do that exercise. You're trying to increase power through hip function. You're trying to get them to use their hips to really create as much power as possible. Now, Georgie, because she's got cerebral palsy, she's got a shorter left arm, so she can't functionally get into that position to clean. So how do we improve that hip function? Well, here you go. Look at the hips. You're trying to push your hips forward through a kettlebell swing and push. I was talking there as if I was coaching. I do apologise. So you can see there are lots of adaptations just with a little bit of thought that you can, understand what you're trying to get the exercise to do. You don't have to use the traditional movement to get what you want. There are opportunities to do other things. I'm going to go back a slide. Now, before we go on to kind of the classification stuff. Is there any more questions around what we've just been through? Mike Utting. Good evening, Mike. How you doing? One athlete I have only recently been coaching has been asked by her main coaches to change her stronger side. She has CP on her right side. She's finding this confusing and stressful. My reply was to continue and to speak to her main coaches. So I'm trying to support her. Any thoughts? Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, it depends on where the athlete is in the development. And one of the things I know about athletes with CP is that it generally comes along with some other issues. Sometimes it's hearing, sometimes it's sight, sometimes it's a slight learning difficulty or a bit of autism. But in general, CP athletes really don't like change too much, and it will stress them out. And if you're going to change something for the CP athlete, again, it's about how you articulate that to the individual. You have to have a really good explanation as to why you're doing that. So I'm kind of not surprised that had stressed the athlete out. And when you say changing on to the strong side, so one of the things that I've done in the past, and I've done exactly this, is I've made sure out of a set of blocks, an athlete is coming out onto the stronger leg, so there's more balance off that first foot that hits the floor, because if they're coming out onto the weaker side and the very first foot on the floor is unbalanced, it affects too many strides straight after. And that doesn't mean that that's the answer. What it does mean is you have to work with the athlete and do what's best for them. So it's a difficult one, Mike, because we could potentially all have a slightly different view, but it should be always what's best for the athlete. Excuse me. As well as motivation, neurological considerations in CP athletes, are there any differences around developing the energy systems? So, like I said, so CP athletes will fatigue quicker than athletes that haven't got cerebral palsy. So consider that 60% of the muscle bulk is the only thing that works effectively. So everything else has to compensate. How an athlete with CP balances, where we may use just one or two muscles to balance, an athlete with CP will use lots, because neurologically they're firing information to try and balance. So they will use everything that they've got to try and balance. So their energy loss is through the roof. They use kind of 2/3 more energy than we do. So one of the considerations with an athlete with CP, if you've got an athlete, is as a coach, it's an observational thing. So I know with Sean Burrows, if we're doing 12 150s off 90 seconds, I know Sean's going to get to about number 5 and his leg may start to shake a bit, or he'll come back with his left hand on his left leg, and I know he's starting to fatigue. A bit of extra rest. Keep that bit of extra rest in there. And once they get that bit of extra rest, they're kind of good to go again. The other thing is heat. If you're trying to train really hard in the winter with an athlete that's got cerebral palsy, they will neurally get really, really tight and potentially get injuries. So that's something to be really aware of with athletes with cerebral palsy. If you see the gait really changing a lot, consider what you do as far as, if you're fortunate enough to have an indoors, go indoors and do some stuff, or get some heated pants like cyclists use so that they can use. So if you can get them to train more, you'll develop their energy systems the same as you would do with any other athlete. It's just figuring out where their fatigue levels are to allow you to do that. I hope that helps, Mike. How would you be able to manage the heat of an athlete in a call room? So like I just said, we use heated pants or tracksuit bottoms that cyclists use because it's really effective. because you're able to manage the heat in there. They come with a little battery pack that an athlete can wear into the call room, and they can sit there. So if I give you the process that I used with Sophie Hahn, was we developed this around Sophie Hahn so that she could go into the call room, stay warm. Generally, it's a 20-minute or a half an hour call room. Every 5 minutes, she did 5 or 6 reactive jumps, just nice, simple jumps to neurally activate and then sit back down again. And I know that caused a lot of questions with people in the call room because they've seen Sophie doing something very, very different. But actually, using that HEE for an athlete with cerebral palsy is very effective, but only if you use it with neurological firing as well. Any top tips for coaching deaf-blind athletes, from how you can get them active to helping them feel safe in the training environment, including trusting people around them? Okay, so this is one of the things I've got to say. I've never coached a deaf-blind athlete. I've coached an athlete that's deaf, profoundly deaf, but hasn't been blind, and I've coached an athlete that's profoundly blind but not deaf. So for me, when you have an athlete that has got a visual impairment, one of the things that they rely on is their guide, so someone that they're strapped to at all times. So for me, one of the things that I use in my team is a buddy-buddy system. And I think if you've got an athlete that's deaf and blind, I think your consideration around that is one of the instances where they would need that guide with them all of the time they're at a track. And then it's about moving people into a position that you want them to move to. I'm not sure about your communication process with that. I'd have to go back and kind of do some research on how that has worked in the past. So I'm sorry, I can't really help you with that. And I'm sure that that's a challenge, but there will be ways around it. But my first instance would be get them one guide that they work with all the time and build up their confidence that way. I hope that helps, Liana. Where there is so this is from Graham, where there is a single side impairment, do you introduce more single leg work to challenge movement as athletes progress? I always challenge balance on my athletes, and one of the conversations I had earlier on today was around, I'm absolutely one of those coaches that's not afraid to go, and even with Libby Clegg, who I know if Libby hasn't been training for a while, Libby comes in, and balance is one of the first things to go, absolutely back to basics. And, single leg work, you do have to have a look at how you can maximize, strength on both sides. And if you can understand where the weakness is on the single side, you can try and maximize that, absolutely. But I not generally do it through balance. And would I introduce more single leg work to challenge the movement? I would first understand whether the movement is poor learned movement or poor movement because of the impairment. And that would then decide which way you go with that. So someone with talipes, where there's no calf, I get my athletes to work on strengthening that side, knowing that there's very little Achilles and calf function through there. So I'm not going to get massive strength loading on it, but I will work it to make sure that I get some strength loading. Daniel McCarrick, my coach took me back to basics and now I represent Wales at able-bodied. Well done. That's absolutely amazing. Well done. What is the best way to push para race walking as a para discipline? And you'll see on the next slide, there's over 40 different classifications in para athletics. And the newest event that's come into para sport that was at the World Championships was race running. And if any of you have not seen that, it's an athlete with an impairment kind of on a three-wheeled bike, but to use their feet along the floor to propel themselves. Absolutely incredible event. Part of the problem is that because there's so many classifications, trying to look at all events that become Paralympic events is absolute nightmare, because there's only a certain amount of time and a certain amount of athletes. In the Olympics, there is one men's 100-meter final, there is one women's 100-meter final. In para-athletics, you can have a number of 100-meter finals for men, you can have a number of 100-meter finals for women. So the amount of the same events that are at world para events or Paralympic events is huge. So it's impossible to put every event in. But, you know, race walking, if you're doing really well as an able-bodied athlete, and even though you've got an impairment, keep doing that. Will it ever become a paradiscipline? I don't know. I'm not the one that makes the decisions on that. But look, well do you for representing Wales. That's incredible. Bash, what would be the escape routines with lifts and impairments? Or is it a case of walking mostly submaximal? Any unique ideas? So the walking in the gym, as you've already seen, you can do anything. You can just about adapt any exercise for a para athlete to go and functionally go do an exercise that you're trying to get the right result. And this is a question that is for any athlete, depending on where you are in the season. You still have to prepare people for major championships. You can't always walk sub-maximal. Sometimes you have to push that. So sorry, I don't know what happened there, and my sound was gone a little bit funny. Shaq, if you're still there, can you hear me?
Hear you. It's gone a bit dialogue-y, but it's back now, I think.
Okay. Yeah. So sorry, back to your question. Yeah, I mean the lifts and impairments that have a good recipe coach, they will adapt to. And Sam Heath coach information is on the information slide at the end. So, like I said, Sam has got an absolute bank of information around routines, things that he's using for people that have got lower limb impairments, upper limb impairments. And one of the things that we're really trying to work on is get more information around, you know, wheelchair athletes. We don't tend to have a lot of wheelchair athletes in Loughborough, so it's one of the things that I'm kind of really passionate about doing and trying to get more information on. Andy Popson, do apparently you making significant differences in session volumes? Well, so you've got an athlete that's wearing a socket and a blade, potentially they need to take that sock off regularly so that they can drop them. So there would be some adaptations that you'd have to maybe make to your plan. As far as volumes are concerned, I certainly haven't changed any volume that Sean Burke has done. Haven't changed any volume that Tom Young has done. And all they do then to get the right volume, or the session volume, is I may put in more reps to enable them to complete the volume of work. Excuse me. Is that no? Um, yeah. So again, there's another list of information here around classification, and this is just small information that's on there. So if you've got some more questions, I'm happy to answer some more. Jeffrey Baracus, would you give a CP athlete longer periods of recovery between sessions? Potentially, yes. It just, a lot of that depends on the time of the year as well. So, like I said, if it's winter, they don't recover as well. Where in the summer, the recovery tends to be better. So, judge that with your individual athlete. You've made a reference to becoming more and more difficult to make it a para sport. Your athlete, Laura Sugar, is a great example of what can be achieved across so much, as she is a good at sports. She played hockey for Wales internationally, athletic sprints, long jump, and now canoe. I wonder what else is next. How do you manage the training of multiple sports for these kind of para superstars? That's a massive team effort. I also coach Kadina Cox, who does cycling and sprints. So, first thought is always this is about the athlete and the team behind the athlete. So, the communication process between all coaches, medical, and anything that concerns the welfare of the athlete is absolutely key. And then ensuring that the workload allows the athlete the right amount of recovery because that's going to be key if they're doing lots of sports. But really good question. And Laura Sugar is an incredible athlete. And so some people have said about the slides. So the information on the slide, on this particular slide, is just a small amount of information around the different classifications. So you can see here, T is track, F is field. So F11 to F13, visual impairment, T11 to T13, visual impairment. So it's only a small bit of information. This one, around the neurological classes, I've put in more information, because this is one that is probably the less obvious, and it's the one that I think causes the most conversation. So there's a bit more information there. Is there any more questions? Some good ideas this evening. I would encourage as many as possible to be inclusive. Yes, it is just coaching. Exactly, Graham. Well done. Okay, I think that's the end. And I think Jan is going to probably close this, if I'm not wrong. The information here is the up and coming webinar. And I've been logging on to these, and I found them massively helpful. And it's also great to listen to people and their aspects on coaching. And here, contact details for myself. By all means, contact me. Anything that I help you with, I'm happy to help. Sam Heathcote, absolute font of null around adaptions from S&C.